God really imparts into him when he's in a palace. He's in a great place. His life is wonderful and it's great. And God puts a burden on his heart for a city that's really a city of rubbles. It's broken, and yet he becomes a person. As he's praying for that city, God puts a burden on his heart for that city, and he leaves behind this incredible blessing that he's in order to accomplish what God's calling him to, and it's pretty difficult. You know, the book of Nehemiah was either written by Ezra or Nehemiah. Nobody's really sure. People tend to lean more toward the idea that it was written by Ezra, maybe narrated by Nehemiah. The time period of it would have been somewhere between 445 and 420 BC. When Nehemiah was appointed as a governor over Judah, and Ezra would have become one of the priests in the city of Jerusalem. Up to this point, the Israelites are in exile. And Nehemiah, who's got this really a great position where he's at, starts to get a burden for the city, and he goes to the king, King Xerxes, and he says, listen, I need to go back to Jerusalem, and he gives him his favor, and so he heads back to Jerusalem, and when he gets there, it is bad. We went over that. You ended last week on talking about that. But one of the three of the people he encounters is Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And these three people become obstacles to Nehemiah. And whenever we're called really to do something incredible, this task that Nehemiah was undertaking was an incredible task, far beyond anything he was going to be able to do in his own strength. And so he needed to enlist the nobles and the people of the people in that area of Jerusalem and even the surrounding areas, which is enough of a challenge in and of himself. But then to throw into the mix these three governors, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, were governors of surrounding areas that did not want Judah to rebuild this wall. And even though it was a daunting task, these guys were going to do everything they can to try to make it even more difficult. And when you go through this, I've taught on this quite a bit, and one of the things I've found in this that I'm going to bring up to you, and in fact, to Brad out there right now who's listening to this, he and I were talking about going through the Bible in a year. One of the things kind of an assignment I gave him, I said, see if you can find the 7 attacks that Geshem, Tobiah, and Sanballat used against Nehemiah in chapter 4, 5, and 6. And I'm going to give them to you right now. If you take a look at Nehemiah 4, 1 to 2, the first one's pretty obvious. And we see this. These are 7 attacks Satan uses against anyone trying to accomplish a God-given burden. Anytime, if you're part of a ministry or 501c3, or you're part of a church that's starting out, or you're part of anything that confronts what Satan is against, he's going to use these 7 attacks against you, and they can help you kind of prepare for that. In verse 1, it says, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. And then what here it is, he ridiculed the Jews. He began to attack them. And we see this really in every aspect. We do a podcast. We get people that ridicule us. They mock us. They laugh at us. Whenever you're trying to do something, if people are against you accomplishing it, there's going to be an attack. They're going to attack you. They're going to make fun of you. That Satan does not want you sharing the gospel with people. So he puts the fear of ridicule, or he puts family members that mock you or ridicule you for what you're doing. You leave a cush job. You leave a great paying job. You leave a situation that's perfect to fulfill something God's put on your heart to go in the mission field or to be a part of a ministry. And they're like, what are you thinking? And really, they don't have the courage to do that. They have no part in what you're doing. And that's what Nehemiah says to them. You have no part in this blessing, and yet you want to keep us from it. Like you're your opinion, but your motive is to try to prevent us from the blessing of the task God's given us. And so the first attack we find is ridicule. And when ridicule didn't work and they continued to build the wall, when they ignored the ridicule and they continued, Nehemiah, in Nehemiah 4, 7, and 8, we find that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem used the next weapon or attack, which was violence. And you can see this in verse 7 and 8, where they said this. They said, but when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the men of Ashdod heard that the repairs in Jerusalem's wall had gone ahead, that their ridicule didn't work, and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry, and they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat, which is interesting. These are governors under the leadership of the king that sent Nehemiah there. And yet they threatened that they were going to come and kill the people rebuilding the wall. And there is always going to be a threat. The enemy is always going to use the threat of violence in your life to prevent you from accomplishing the calling in which God has on your life. And we see Satan doing that, and we see Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem threatening that if you don't stop building this wall, we're going to come and kill you. And to meet that threat, they posted guards at the places to protect the builders, so that if they came, they would be ready for them. And I really do want to encourage, anytime you're doing something that God has put on your heart to do that, and Satan's coming to threaten that, you do need to take it seriously. You need to guard those areas. They didn't ignore it like they did the ridicule. They prepared for it. They posted people to prepare for the violence that would come. The third thing that Satan brought and kind of fed into was discouragement. Now, some would argue that this isn't necessarily Satan bringing it, but it's a natural human condition. When we're in the middle of a task and it seems to get arduous or difficult, it's easy to find ourselves getting discouraged. You've been attacked, you've been ridiculed, you've been mocked, you've been made fun of, and then there's the threat of death that's looming over you at every turn. It can lead to discouragement, and we see that there is discouragement in verse 10 and 12. It says, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. That they're beginning to see the task and the impossibility. Like they're in the middle of it, and they're seeing the whole of the project and just getting individual victories. And okay, we built it this far, we won, we accomplished it. Now let's keep going. Whenever you're involved in something so massive and incredible, something so transformative, it is that one of the great enemies you have to overcome is discouragement. That you have to see that every day we're moving in the right direction. And even though it looks overwhelming, we're going to accomplish it. In verse 11, it says, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. And there's constantly, he comes to try to take courage. Satan wants to take courage. He wants to discourage. He wants to try to empty all of us. So the first one was ridicule. When that didn't work, they brought violence. When that didn't work, they fed into discouragement. And then when that didn't work, in chapter 6, verse 1, they used compromise. They tried to get, as the wall is being built, and in chapter 5, what we see is the wall continues to be built. And it kind of gives the narrative and how the wall is being built over that period of time. And then we come to verse 1 in chapter 6, and it says, when the word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent this message to me, come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Oh no. And Nehemiah goes, oh no, I am not meeting you there. Nehemiah is not stupid. He understands that these people have been working to discourage his laborers, and the guards had threatened violence, had been mocking them. And now, because they've succeeded, they want to have some form of treaty or some conversation. Nehemiah understands these are not my friends, and he doesn't compromise. He doesn't get off the wall in order to make friends with the enemy. He continues doing the work. He sees right through it. The people who are working against you are not interested in them making you friends. They're not interested in having relationship with you, and you don't need to compromise. That's what got Eve in trouble in the garden, and it would have been what got Nehemiah in trouble on the wall if he'd gotten off. And he says, I'm not getting off the wall to have a conversation with you in the plain of oh no. It says, but they were scheming to harm him. And that's exactly what happens when we compromise. When you've been given a vision and a passion, you don't compromise. God, again and again through the Bible, and we've seen this as we've read through the Bible, it's when we compromise what God's told us to do that we end up in trouble. Remember, I'm remembering the man who came to Jeroboam and said, this altar will be destroyed, and the one who created on it will be destroyed. And Jeroboam tried to get him to stay, and he said, no, God told me to tell the prophecy and then get out of here. And he leaves, but another prophet gets him to stay, and he ends up dead. You don't compromise what you know God is telling you to do. You follow through on what his word is to you, and you leave it there. And when that didn't work, when he would not compromise and would not move in that direction, go to verse 5, we see that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem then resort to slander and blackmail. And you'll see this in verse 5 and 7. It says, then the fifth time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message in his hand. It was an unsealed letter in which it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let us confer together. He's not getting off the wall to talk with them, because they want to scheme against him and kill him. He's not going to do that. And so they threaten him with slander, which means slanders make up things about you. And when you're doing, you can expect that when you're accomplishing what God wants you to do, people are going to make things up about you. And the blackmail that was being used. Verse 8, he said, I sent him this reply, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your own head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. So Tobiah, when they couldn't get him to compromise, then he tried to use slander and blackmail, made up stuff, was going to tell people things about them to try to discourage them and defeat them. It reminded me of a story that Rick Warren told us one time when I had an opportunity to be at an event with a small group of people, and he was sharing just some things about his life. And he told a story about how Billy Graham had called him and said to him, when you, because it was kind of like a passing of the mantle. Billy Graham was kind of the nation's pastor, and he kind of passed that to Rick Warren. And Rick Warren said the greatest advice Billy Graham gave him was that when you wrestle with pigs, you're both going to get dirty, but only one of you is going to like it. Don't fall into the trap of getting into wrestling matches with people who claim one thing and are only trying to get you in the mud.
Yeah.
You just don't get into the wrestling match with the pigs. And there will be plenty of pigs wanting you to wrestle them in the mud. You just avoid it. You don't need to defend yourself. You need to build the wall. If it gets him defending himself, he's not building the wall, and Tobiah, Geshem, and Sanballat have won. Now, what are the next two? Because those are all common. We've all seen that, and probably in some cases we've had that experience. Well, here's these next ones are pretty destructive, can be somewhat emotionally. I mean, slander and blackmail can take it out of you. And it's why Nehemiah prayed that God would strengthen his hands. But these next two can be pretty tough. One is the spy in the land. You look at verse 10. It says, one day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Deliah, son of Metatellabah, who was shut in at his home, and he said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple door, because men are coming to kill you. By night they're coming to kill you. There was a spy in the land, an angel of light sent by Satan, and they show up in your life. There will be people that will come as though they're for you, but they're actually leading you down a path to destroy you. It would have been sinful for Nehemiah to go into the house of the Lord, but he tried to justify why it was okay because of the threat that they're trying to kill you. And so this spy in the land was trying to create a pervasive mindset that he was there to protect Nehemiah, when in reality he was trying to bring Nehemiah into sin against his God, and to get Nehemiah off the wall to be protected rather than to continue doing what God had told him. And there are people in our life that are trying to tell you to do things that do not lead you in the right direction. You got to guard your heart. You know, a great example of this is Lot. Do you know that Abraham was given a vision of the stars in the sky? And it wasn't till Abraham dismissed Lot from his presence, where they separated, that God then took him out and spoke to him again. Because Lot was a spy in Abraham's life. Lot became an obstacle that caused him to go to Egypt during the drought in the Promised Land. When they got to the Promised Land, there was a drought in the land, and it was Lot and Sarah, but primarily Lot, that convinced Abraham they needed to go to Egypt. And going to Egypt created the issue we have now with Sarah, and then you have Hagar, who is really picked up in Egypt. And so it's an important thing to recognize. When there are people of light that give you information, you need discernment. You need to be able to discern, no, that person is an angel of light, but he is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I need to guard myself. And the spirit in you will kind of attest that something is wrong with that. So you need to guard your life from the spy in the land. And finally, the seventh weapon that the enemy will use is traitors. And these can be the most painful. If you look at 17 through 19, it says, also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah. So there were nobles that were working with Nehemiah that were sending letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to Tobiah, since he was a son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Era. His son was Jehohanan, had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So there are traitors that were working with Nehemiah, and that will take away a lot of energy. When you have people who are supposed to be there supporting you, and they've given their loyalties to your enemy, and they don't let you know that. And so you have people you think are working for you, but subtly they're working behind the scenes against you. The project is already large enough. It's already a great task. But then to have to deal with people who are working against you, that becomes even more difficult. And those are the 7 attacks: ridicule, violence, discouragement, compromise, slander and blackmail, spies that are in our land, and traitors. And this is something that we see happening throughout this time. Now, Nehemiah, what's interesting as a leader, you see a lot of characteristics in Nehemiah here of great leader. One, he doesn't take the portion of the size of the governors. He actually says, you know what, I'm going to take my portion that's which I deserve as the governor, and I'm going to take less, and I'm going to bring in the workers, and we're going to do this together. I'm going to cause them to come together where we eat, where we have, we lift them up, and I'm going to not put pressure on people. And yet there was corruption going on because some of the nobles were taking advantage of the situation and trying to make money and increase their position during this time. And Nehemiah, every time you get into a situation like this, there are people who are like vultures looking for ways to capitalize. And when Nehemiah hears about it, he comes down on them and says, if we're going to accomplish what God's asking us, no one's capitalizing on this. We need to be people that are supporting one another, standing with one another, and the nobles agree with him, and that's exactly what they do. So we go to finish up chapter 6, in verse 15 and 16 of chapter 6. Let me go back to that. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul, in 52 days. Now that's incredible, really. When you think about how massive that wall is, that's pretty amazing. When all of our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. That's how impossible this was. It became a testimony that God was with these people. And he says, also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah. And this is where we see this undermining of things that is going to have to be dealt with later on. So in chapter 7, it goes through all of the people who are the leaders of this community of people in Judah. And the first return of those taken in exile, we're seeing the people coming back to Judah. Now the wall is going up. People are returning back to the city. There are about 42,360 people that are now coming back. Millions, many would argue that millions had been taken into captivity, but now thousands are coming back. And what we discover is there are many Jews that intermarry where they're at, and they never come back. So it kind of is a restart in Judah and Jerusalem. And it's interesting because what we're also going to see here is the divided nation of Israel does not come back as the divided nation. When it starts to come back and reform its wall of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel that is there before it's conquered by other nations, it comes back really as a nation of Israel. So when Jesus gets there, there isn't a divided kingdom. There isn't a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The exile kind of ends that. And the people of Israel really start to come back together. And we see in Nehemiah 8, once the wall is built, they begin to do a celebration. And this is where we see Ezra step on the scene. And they bring the book of the law. And after they do this, and this is important in Nehemiah, that they bring the law and place it at the center of all of this. And really, in this chapter, you kind of discover it's like a church service. They have all the people come together. There's a platform. There's a reading of the law. They actually talk to the people about what it means. There's an interpretation. There's worship where there's a raising of hands. It says that they bow down and they pray. There's a praying to the Lord. So in verse 8, you look at verse 8 of chapter 8, it says, it's very much like a Sunday. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving the meaning so that the people could understand what was being read. So basically, you're seeing sermons being preached at this time, and it was a people coming to God and worshiping God and acknowledging God. In verse 10, it says, Nehemiah said, go, enjoy choice food, sweet drinks, send some to those who have nothing prepared. And then it says this, and it says this statement numerous times, this day is sacred to the Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. This day is sacred to the Lord. And they celebrated the Feast of Booths. This was the feast that they had not celebrated. In fact, they said they celebrated it so much so that it wasn't celebrated like that since the days of Joshua. and that it was celebrated. Then he said to them, "Go your way, eat fat, drink sweet, send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to the Lord. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And so they celebrated it.
So Sean asks a question. He says, why did Nehemiah tell them not to weep, for the day was holy?
Because there had been a lot of weeping. This was not a day to weep. This was a day to rejoice that the wall had been, there had been a lot of weeping. Vision comes with weeping. But when you see it completed, it was a time to celebrate. It was a time to rejoice and to be excited. Now, was there crying? I'm sure for many there was crying because they were seeing it, but it was weeping of joy. The comment here, and it's translated weeping, but there are different words in Hebrew used for that as well. And there is a burden of weeping and crying out to, like Nehemiah did when he wept over the wall. But he was saying, today isn't that day. Today is a day of victory. Today is a day of accomplishment. And think about it. They had worked all of this time under the oppression and the threat of people trying to stop them. And they accomplished the goal. And they did it with God. And the only way they could do it was with God. It was a partnership. They had accomplished something with God. And so they came and they celebrated. They preached the law. It was coming back to the people. It was reorientation. It was returning to God and seeing old things that had passed away come out of the ashes and become new. It was an exciting time during this period of time. Okay. Any other questions that are out there?
Yeah, if you have any other questions, I am watching them. Pastor James is going to keep reading and going over his notes. But if you guys got questions, let me know. I'm watching the comments.
So now we take a shift from Nehemiah at Nehemiah 9 from building the wall. Now we're taking a shift to why does who is this God? How do we worship him? What are the principles that make us different from everyone else? And what is the truth that we should live by? And you look at Nehemiah 9, he makes this shift and he comes back to some pretty simple concepts that really the pagans don't live by. And these are novel things. And I think even in our own culture, we've gotten away from. We don't see the importance of it. We don't think it's a big deal. But in verse 14 of chapter 9, he says, "You made known to them your holy Sabbath and gave them commands, decrees, and laws through your servant Moses." Like the Sabbath, to us, we think of the Sabbath, that's just a common old-time principle. The Sabbath was not common among men. It was a creational principle, but it wasn't common among men at that time. And when Moses was given the law, God says, "I want you to honor the Sabbath." The Sabbath was really given to us by God. And when we ignored the Sabbath, it's almost as a disregard for God. Like he's like, "I want you to Sabbath because I want you to remember. I want you to enjoy. I want you to refuel. I want you to relax. I've created you to enjoy my creation, not to always work." And the pagans didn't have a Sabbath. And when they were not remembering the Sabbath, they were actually acting more like the pagans than they were followers of Christ. And one of the characteristics that separated them from the pagans and caused them to be different from the pagans was the fact that they honored the Sabbath because they trusted that God would provide for them on the day they did not work, that God would be a provision. And you think of like Chick-fil-A, man, it's closed on the Sabbath, and that irritates some people because they're closing the Sabbath, but props to Chick-fil-A. They've stayed true to that, and God has blessed them even though they don't do that. You'll look at verse 17 of chapter 9. It says, "They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. Therefore, you did not desert them." You got to love that about God. What a verse that while I was reading it, I read that and I thought, wow, God, your character is incredible. Even when they disobey you, you may have allowed them to experience the consequences of those decisions, but you didn't abandon them. God has never abandoned you. He's never abandoned me. Like, no matter what you do, God may remove the covering because that's what you've decided you want in the decisions you made when you stepped into disobedience. But God's mercy causes him never to abandon you. He's like right there within a shout. So you could call out on God and he will be there. And it's just an incredible thing to see. And when you do call out, in verse 35 of chapter 9, it says, even while they were in their kingdom, enjoying their great goodness to them in the spacious, fertile land you gave them, they did not serve you or turn from their evil ways. While living in God's blessing, they would not serve them. I don't know about you. I know I'm living in God's blessing. And our response to God is to serve him, to serve God. And I want to encourage you to do that, is recognize that we are living in his blessing and to serve them. And Nehemiah did that. Then in Nehemiah 10, there's this binding agreement. And Nehemiah leads the people into a binding agreement, into an oath to the law before God. And then Nehemiah details what it is that they're binding themselves to. And what is interesting is what is listed in the chapter is the sacrifices they were binding themselves to. They were binding themselves to the forgiveness, and they were binding themselves to the creational principles. So they were binding themselves to those things that were life-giving things, and yet they abandoned them. Even even though they were bound to those things, as soon as they were bound to, it was like they went away and they lived as they had always lived. You know what's interesting here? If knowledge could change your life, it would have changed their hearts right here. It does not have the ability. Again and again, we see the people of God want to do good and leave and go back and do things that are contrary to God. When Jesus came to earth, he gave us an example and then said, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit to help you live out what people of the past were not able to live out in their own willpower. And we see it again and again through Nehemiah. They had just built the wall. God had just done it. I mean, all the surrounding nations were like, wow, they didn't do that on their own. They did that with the help of God. And they've seen God's provision for them in doing that. And then they go away and they depend on themselves, depend on other gods, instead of depending on the one who helped them even be in the position that they're in. So as the Jews are coming back, as its remnant of Israel and Judah, they're returning really as one people. And we see that in Nehemiah 11, where when they're coming back, we see that they're not coming back as the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, that they're coming back really as one people. And in chapter 12, you see this history of the names that really bring credibility to the Bible. When people say, well, I don't know if I believe the Bible or is written by man or what is the credibility of the Bible. When you see the list of names and the genealogies that are there, those are there really to bring credibility that we're not just saying generations past. We're telling you who the people were. These were real people. Like, these were real people that came from this generation that were born to this son, this son, this son, this father, this father. They're all listed there because it really happened. That this isn't made up. That it has historical context along with the biblical or spiritual context that comes with the Bible when you read it. And one of the things you see in Nehemiah 12, right in the beginning, is these are the priests and Levites who returned, verse 1, with Zerubbabel. And you say, well, that's a difficult thing to say, but Zerubbabel is the one who rebuilds the temple in the new wall. So when Nehemiah builds the wall, they rebuild the temple, and he's coming to do that because the wall is done. So they dedicate the wall in chapter 12, and in verse 43 of chapter 12 it says, and on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy, and the women and children also rejoiced, and the sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. They celebrated their accomplishments they experienced with God. They began to worship. Really, they began testifying. And I think it was a great example of they begin to tell the stories. Remember when we had that one rock and it seemed so big and we didn't know? Remember when we were pulling up the rock and the donkey tripped on the stick because John over there didn't pick it up? Remember when that rock was a little too big and we had to shave it out? We didn't know how to do it. And then so-and-so, William got some wisdom. Remember we were so hot and tired and Mary showed up with a big thing of water, and then the horse fell over and the water spilt on the ground, and it was like we wanted to lick the water out of the dirt. You remember? Yeah, I remember. And they're reminiscing the number of things that happened and which caused this big miracle to take place. They were testifying of what took. Remember how we thought we were going to be dead and we were freaking out, and they were remembering how God pulled them through. And there's something about testifying about what happens. Do you remember what God's done in your life? Remember those times, because when you begin to remember how God did things in your past, you stand in something in your future. You have experiences you can stand in your future, and want to encourage you to do that. Then you go to chapter 13, Nehemiah 13, and as we come in here, you find an interesting story. In fact, I thought this was an interesting story. It's the last chapter of the Bible, and it says, Elishib provided Tobiah a room for storage for his household goods in the house of God. So how rich is this? Tobiah, who is working to prevent the wall from being built, and the wall gets built, and then the temple's being built and is being rebuilt by Zerubbabel, and he needs storage. So Tobiah, who didn't even want it built, then goes to Elishib, a priest, and says, hey, could I get a room to put some of my stuff in? Look at this. In verse 4 of chapter 13, before this, Elishib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. So this is a guy that's had divided loyalties. He's been working with Nehemiah, but he's tied to Tobiah. And he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense for the temple articles, and also the tithe of grain and new wine oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all of this was going on, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. He was in the 32nd year. He's with Xerxes, Artaxerxes, king of Babylon. I had returned to the king sometime later, and I asked his permission, came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Elishib had done in providing Tobiah, the obstacle, a room in the courts of the house of God. This guy gives him, no, dude, you don't get to do this. So what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah actually takes all of Tobiah's stuff when he finds out it's his stuff, and he throws it out in the front yard. I mean, he takes it and just throws it all out for people to take or whatever, because he's frustrated that Elishib had done this. And in verse 14, he says, remember me for this, because even though he's accomplished the task, he's just frustrated with all of the things that are going on, and he's trying to bring the people to God, and it's a challenge. And in verse 14, he says, God, remember me for this, oh my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services, because men aren't remembering it, because it's such a challenge. But God, I just lay it before you and ask that you would not forget what I accomplished. It's such a great narrative. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy it. It's a story of difficulty, obstacles, people working against you and coming through, and it really is a great, a true story in the Bible, and then it leads to another incredible story where Nehemiah is working with Artaxerxes. Esther is working with Xerxes, who is a very powerful king. And Esther is tied really to where the Feast of Purim began, where the Israelites began celebrating the Feast of Purim. The author is really unknown. We don't know who the author is. And the time period of this book is somewhere between 460 and 350 BC. So if you look at the time period of Nehemiah, that is between 445 and 420, the story of Nehemiah and Esther are somewhere close to each other. They're different kings, so we know they're not at the same time, but they're somewhere in that period. They're right around each other. And King Xerxes, we find out about Queen Vashti and King Xerxes. The first chapter of Esther is really about the kingdom and about this relationship between Xerxes and Vashti, who is this beautiful woman. Xerxes throwing these parties. The woman says, he says, I want the queen to come out and I want everybody to behold her beauty. The queen says, I'm not going out. There's no way. It would not come out when the king demanded it. And because of that, all of his advisors, he goes to his advisor, says, what do I do with the queen? She didn't listen to me. And the advisor's like, if she ain't going to listen to you, then none of our women are going to listen to us. And so if you don't do anything, there's going to be uprising in all of our houses. So you got to make a decree that she needs to be punished. And so a decree is made, or edict, whatever you want to call it, where Vashti loses her crown as queen, and she'll be held in holding and not ever able to come in the presence of the king. And there would be a search for a new queen. Well, in chapter 2, after the king's anger subsides, he realizes he doesn't like his decree. She was a beautiful woman. He wants her to be in his presence, but he can't because he made a decree that she couldn't be. So he's stuck. And someone comes to him and says, hey, how about we go throughout the kingdom and we find a beautiful woman? And so some of you out there who are not married going, well, yeah, let's do one of those decrees right now. Let's go find the one. So he finds one of his eunuchs, and we start to get introduced to the first character of this, well, really the third, if you consider the king Xerxes and then Vashti. The third is Haggai, who is one of the king's eunuchs. And what a eunuch is someone who has severed from their life the ability to be attracted to, in a physical way, to another person. It's a male. The drive that they would have had, it's probably a PG-13 way of saying what a eunuch is. It's literally been severed from their life so that the king could trust the eunuch with his harem of women. He wanted someone that could care for them, help them, make them more beautiful, but would not be attracted to them. And that's what a eunuch would do. And it says that when they went out on the search, they found this woman named Hadassah. Hadassah, who we know later to be Esther, she was also called Esther, was the cousin of a man named Mordecai. But Mordecai, Hadassah, or Esther's parents had died, and Mordecai had taken the responsibility, or Mordecai had taken the responsibility of taking care of Esther. And when Mordecai heard that there was this beauty search going on, that Miss America, Miss Persia is going on, he introduced it to Esther and said, you should try to do this. You're a beautiful woman. You should go and do this. And Esther had the favor of Haggai. She was one of the women selected. They would go through this process of a number of days. and months, receiving treatments. She would live in this harem of women seeking to become the queen. And, it sounds like a great TV show these days. The Bachelor or the Bachelorette, is one of these, like, I'm trying to get the eye of the king. And so they're cared for. And Haggai actually favors her and gives her wisdom about how to get the attention of the king. And because of that, she becomes queen to the most powerful man on the planet at that time. Like, literally, this little girl whose parents died grows to be the queen of the most powerful kingdom on the planet at that time. It's amazing, and there's a reason for it. And Mordecai and Esther happen at one point in chapter 2. They hear about an assassination attempt, and Mordecai goes to Esther, says, go talk to the king. They do, and they end up stopping the assassination attempt. And then really that's the last time that we hear that the people who are going to do the assassination are killed. But nothing's really said about what happens for Mordecai. Like, there's no reward that comes. We don't hear anything about that. But in place of the people who are trying to assassinate him arises the next character, Haman. And he's promoted to this position. He is hungry for power, and he wants people to honor him. So that when Haman would come, he'd want everyone to bow before him. And Mordecai would not bow before him because he was a Jew, and you don't bow before anyone but God. Haman wanted to kill Mordecai for it. And because Mordecai wouldn't bow, and because he was a Jew, Haman hated all the Jews, and he just wanted them all dead.
And he was an Amalekite, right? The son of, descendant of King Agag that prophet Samuel killed.
Right.
That's true, yeah. That's what I was like, the descendants thing, more than ever when I've read it through this time, because we've just laid the groundwork. I'm like, oh, like there's some long-standing beef here.
And whether he knows that or not,
yeah, it's just interesting.
It can be there can be generational things that are passed on. But Haman does not like Jews. I mean, he doesn't like Mordecai because he doesn't bow, and he finds out he's a Jew, and that's why he doesn't bow. He gives that reason. It's not just because he just hates, he just doesn't, I'm going to get rid of all the Jews because I'm going to get rid of everybody. They're all going to pay the price for you, Mordecai. He does not like them. So he convinces King Xerxes that he should kill all the Jews in one day. Look at verse 15, actually, of chapter 3 of Esther. You go to chapter 3, verse 15. It says, spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued at the citadel of Susa, which was the capital city. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. They were bewildered because they were like, I mean, think of the number of Jews in Susa, but all over the place. The city's like, what's going on? Why are we killing these people we've been living with? And there were some who loved the idea of killing Jews because they hated the Jews. I mean, there's always been some hatred, anti-Semitism going on throughout. They just hated the Jews because there seemed to be a blessing on a lot of the Jews. And Haman's anger for the Jews really caused them to be deceived. Like, they didn't really, like, the king is really kind of removed from everything that's going on. Haman was kind of the one operating, and it was kind of the go-between the king and the people. And Haman's hatred of the Jews clouded his vision. And there's a disruption. It says that while they were drinking and eating at the citadel, the city of Susa was bewildered. The word bewilder means like, what's going on? Like, why are all of a sudden? And in one day, they were going to kill. In verse 14, a copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as a law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. I mean, Hitler killed Jews over a long period of time. This was an edict that they were to gather up all the Jews on one day. I wonder what day that would have been. And on one day, they were to slaughter all of the Jews.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting is we know that God was already aware of this. We see God's protection of the Jewish people throughout history. This is a perfect example of that protection. And it's in Esther chapter 4 where we see the great dialogue. So if you're going to hear anything from Esther, it's in chapter 4. So right now there's this edict is out there. Haman has convinced the king to kill all the Jews. That's where we're at. And Mordecai learned of what had been done, and he says, okay, I need to go to Esther. Now go to verse 11. This is, if there's anything you've heard from Esther, this is the famous dialogue. This is what goes on. Verse 11, all the king's officials and all the people of the royal province know that for any man and woman who approaches the king in the inner court, because Mordecai comes to Esther and says, Esther, your people, the Jewish people, are going to be killed, and you need to do something. You're the queen. You need to step up and defend your people. No one knows she's a Jew. They had hidden that. Mordecai is saying, now you need to go do this. And she says back to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I've called to go to the king. And when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Why? He's convinced God is going to defend them, but it's going to come from someone else. But he's put you in the position to do this. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to the royal position, what? For such a time as this. That God has put you in this place for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king. And even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all Esther's instruction. It's that statement that God has brought you to this place at such a time as this. And so Esther doesn't just run in to do anything. She's a crafty woman. And she approaches the king. Of course, she made herself extraordinarily beautiful. So he extends the scepter. Women have a tendency to know how to speak to their husbands. and he extends the scepter in chapter 5, verse 9. In chapter 4, verse 11 through 14 talks about that. Then Esther goes to the king. He extends the scepter. She invites him to a banquet. What's crazy, he says, I'll give you up to half the kingdom. But she doesn't then give him her request. She holds it back. She has a plan. She's going to work. She invites him to a banquet, makes it an incredible banquet, serves him, fulfills his desire, all of the things he's looking for. And he asks, what is it you want? She says, I want you to come back tomorrow for the second banquet. And then I'll tell you what it is I want. And the king says, yes. And she says, only one request. You got to bring Haman with you. She is not only trying to save her people, she's going to deal with Haman. And Haman is there for the first banquet. He returns the second. And whenever I read this, I always think it's interesting because in verse 9 of chapter 5, you see Haman's fury increasing. Haman went out that day happy and high spirits because he'd just been at the banquet with the king. He was the only one invited with the king and for the queen. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear of his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Like, he's angry that Mordecai isn't worried about the day of when they're all going to die. Like he's not respecting him at all, and it
fear.
makes him more angry. His fury gets him. And then look at this dialogue that that Haman has with his wife. He says, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the kings had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to a banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. I am being honored. But all of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's. Here he's being honored. He has all of this, but he is going nuts that Mordecai won't bow to him. So his family gives him this great advice: go build gallows. So they build these gallows 70 feet high to kill Mordecai. You know what? You got all this favor. Go ahead and kill Mordecai. And he says, you know what? You're right. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So they build these gallows. And what's interesting is, as he's building the gallows, God's invading the dreams of the king. And God comes to the king, and he can't sleep. So he goes to the chronicles of their, not chronicles in the Bible, but the chronicles of their nation. And he discovers that Mordecai, and he reads it, and he goes, man, did I do anything for them?
Yeah, he prevented the assassination.
Yeah, and he goes, yeah, he reads the story about how he prevented the assassination. I mean, I don't know that I did anything for him. And then the next morning comes, the gallows are either being built or have been built, and there's this collision course that happens between Haman and the Xerxes. Haman's coming to the king to ask permission to kill Mordecai.
Yeah.
And the king is coming to Haman to ask, what should I do for a person I honor, who in his mind is thinking of Mordecai. And so this collision course happens.
But Haman thinks he's talking about Haman.
Right.
I'm the one he needs to honor.
Right. So he says, how do I honor somebody who's worthy of, and he says, you should do all of these things, put him on a horse. He's thinking, what would I want done for me?
Yeah.
And then when he finishes, the king says, excellent, do all of that for Mordecai. And you had to think for a moment that Haman was mortified.
Yeah. Like,
by what? So it doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
But you can imagine what that must have been like.
Sure.
And it says that Haman went out and did it for Mordecai. That he actually had to go and do that, and probably thought in his mind, if one, he's got to be mortified. He's got to be angry. He's got to be humiliated that he wants to kill this. So anyway, all of this happens, and it's a short period of time. This is all moving fairly quickly, and the second banquet's coming up, and Haman and Xerxes go to the banquet with the queen, and the queen reveals to the king what it is. And we see that the edict, she tells him there's an edict given to kill all the Jews, and she asks the king to overturn the edict, and he goes, well, what is it about? And he says, it's the edict that man created that pushed you toward, because he does. And the king steps out of the room because he's angry of how he got suckered into it. And he really does like Esther. She has favor with the king. And when he comes back in verse 8, or chapter 8 chapter 8, verse 17, go to chapter 8, verse 17. I think this is where it is. In every province and every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness when the Jews with fasting celebrate. Well, so this is what happens. The king leaves the room, and Mordecai knows he's Haman knows he's in trouble. And Haman begs to the queen, please have mercy on me. Please don't, because the king is angry.
Oh, yeah.
And when the king comes back, he had fallen on the bed or the sofa, it says, where she was. And the king thinks, you're making a pass at my queen on top of that. And immediately
Bad.
the gallows that were created to hang Mordecai become the gallows that hang Haman, which is interesting. Haman was hung on the gallows built to kill Mordecai. What a lesson.
Which, this is side note, but mine, when I was reading the ESV, it says hanged, but on NIV it says impaled. Like, is that the torture choice of like the Persian Empire? Because later, before Cyrus, I think, when he's like, you guys better obey these commands, and anybody that doesn't listen, let him be taken a pole from his house and then be impaled on it.
Yeah.
Like, is this the weapon of choice for the Persian Empire?
I have no idea, but you would have to argue the fact that the gallows that Haman created, I mean, it says gallows.
Yeah.
So he was, whatever trap the enemy set for you, he was then put on.
I more so just meant the way in which it happened, because it was interesting. Mine says hanged, and then NIV says impaled. And
then everything Haman has, an authority, position, opportunity, is given to Mordecai. And it says that Mordecai becomes the second in command of the entire empire, a Jew. So he would arguably be the most powerful leader Israel ever had in the world. Even though he wasn't the king over Israel, he was second in command over everything in the world at that point. And it said that people, nobles, and the governors of that time became afraid of the Jews because they were not only given a reprieve, and there was great joy, which is verse 17 and 8, where they had great joy because their lives had been spared, which is where the Feast of Purim comes, that their lives were spared, and then they actually go out and kill all of their enemies that were out there that were rejoicing about killing the Jews. They go out and put them to the end. And the king even says something about it. 500, the king comes to him and says 500 in Susa alone were killed. 75,000 people in the province were killed. The enemies of the Jews were killed. It's pretty interesting how many people lost their life. They thought the Jews were all going to be exterminated, but in the end, the enemy of the Jews were all exterminated, and the sons of Haman.
Wow.
Now, I found something that was interesting. So the Feast of Purim is a holiday they still celebrate today. And go to verse 19 of chapter 9. I want you to see something, because one of the customs that was started at that time, verse 19, is very familiar to another custom. It says the Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observed the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. It was a day, it was like Christmas. It was a holiday that was celebrated by giving presents to each other, one to another. And in verse 22, it says, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, this is what Purim was, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration, he wrote to them, observe this day, days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another, gifts to the poor. So it was a day of gifting, very much like what Christmas was, as one of the feasts. Then you go to Esther chapter 10, and Mordecai was second in command of the greatest kingdom on earth. He really becomes like a type of Joseph. Yeah. You really kind of see that Mordecai is really kind of Joseph for the Jewish people, and really leads in a way for an appreciation for the Jews, in which Nehemiah is able to go back to Israel and rebuild the wall, and their support for that. So we move on to Job. So we go from one great story in Nehemiah to another one in Esther, and then we go to a great story in Job, which is considered to be one of the oldest books in the Bible.
Wow.
The author is unknown. The time period is around 22 BC. It's the oldest book in the Bible for sure, sometime between the flood and Moses. likely a contemporary of Abraham. He likely lived about 200 to 220 years. The Alexandrian Septuagint suggests that he lived 240 years. That's how old he would have been. So it would have been closer to the flood.
What, BC?
2200 BC. So it would have been closer to the flood, where people lived longer during that time. He lived in the land of Uz, not Oz. And he was considered to be one of the greatest men in the East. So he was well known because of his great wealth. And he had a lot of children that apparently, because of his wealth, partied all the time while he was expanding his territory. And we see that all in Job chapter 1. And there's some interesting things that are happening in Job chapter 1 that we need to highlight that really kind of affect how theology. Go to verse chapter 6 through 7. It says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. It's talking about the heavenly host, the heavenly courts. And Satan also came with them. So we're talking likely about the angels of darkness, the fallen angels, and Satan. And the Lord said, so it's this heavenly council deal. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan answered the Lord, from roaming through the earth, going back and forth through it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Which is very difficult for some people to comprehend, but there's this conversation between Satan, his fallen angels, and the Lord. And God is introducing Satan to Job, and Satan is already aware of who Job is, and he says, I can't touch Job because you have a hedge around him. And Satan answered the Lord. He says, there is no one on earth like him. This is God. How would you like God to
Pretty great
say this? There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless, upright, a man who fears God, shuns evil. And then Satan says, does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and his herds spread throughout the land. I mean, when God blesses it, you see, I mean, there's so much going on. Satan himself is saying, you bless people. And when you do, it expands at an incredible rate. That's the only
reason why he's worshiping you.
Right. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you in your face. And the Lord said to Satan, very well, then everything he has in your hand, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now, this is very early on. And then we see what would be considered a bad day. An epically bad day.
No
like
good, very
when
bad
you've
day.
had a bad day, you've never had a day like Job has had a bad day. And one after there's no one who's had a worse day. And one after another, things happen where all of his wealth is attacked and destroyed, and one person gets away. And why? To tell Job they're all gone. Whether it was his cattle, his sheep, his camels, and then lastly, someone comes where your children were all partying, the house they were in collapsed on them, and not one left, and I was the only one left to come and tell you that this is a bad day. And it says that he worships God, that then he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave me, the Lord take us away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Wow. This is, in all this, Job did not sin. And look at this, by charging God with wrongdoing.
Wow.
He does not charge God with wrongdoing. He praises God, which is why God had blessed him the way he did. And God is proud of Job. He's looking at Job and he's like, wow, this guy's incredible, right?
Why do bad things happen to good people? There it is.
Right. And he still worships God. So then comes the second test. And the second test, notice verse 1, we see it again on another day. The angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan says he's roaming from the earth, again, just like he was before. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Now, they've already been through this. He says, there's no one like him on the earth. He's blameless, upright. Even when all this bad stuff happened, he still maintained integrity, though you incited against him to ruin him without any reason. Skin for skin, Satan replied. A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse your face. Then the Lord said, very well, then he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. And it says that they were so bad that he would scrape them with broken pottery off his skin. Look at verse 10. Look at verse 10. He says, his wife says, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. And he replies, you are talking like a foolish woman. So we accept good from God and not trouble.
Wow.
In all this, Job did not sin in what he said.
Wow.
Wow is right. God demonstrated this to them. And what we see in chapter 2, Job's 3 friends come, and they're so horrified by his suffering that they can't say anything. They just sit with him and mourn with him. They could not speak by how bad it was. And then Job begins to speak, and when he does speak, he does not curse God, but he curses the day of his birth.
Yeah.
And in verse 8, in fact, you look, may those who curse days curse that day. I wonder, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan, which is interesting because it's a real live thing that existed. What I think is interesting, I wonder what day that was of the year of his birth. He says, those who curse days, curse
Friday
that
the
day.
13th.
Yeah, I wonder what day of the year that was that he was cursing back then. What was the day of his birth? And in verse 25 and 26, and this is where we'll finish, what I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. He is being tortured, and he does not curse God. We lose someone we love and we curse God.
Yeah.
He is under torture that he wishes he was never born, never existed, but he will not curse God because he knows God. And he says, he's the one who blessed me, and I'll accept whatever he gives me. Why? Because he's God. It really is a great counterbalance to a lot of things we read in the Bible, that how life is life, and there's a lot of brokenness in life. There's a devil and angels, and he attacks, but if he throws himself into the hands of God. And we're going to continue through the narrative of Job and in next week, and we're going to get to see how God turns the tables on Satan in this, and Job becomes even more of a man of God and an example to all of us. So for next week, come and join us. Don't quit. Let's keep going. We're almost there, about halfway, and we'll be headed downhill and getting through all of it. God bless you. I pray this blesses you. Have a great, great day.